Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi, and lately a lot of us have been looking to fill a lot of free time with live sports being largely canceled and a lot of now college football upcoming season preparations are up in the air, and a lot of spring games have been canceled, and a lot of recruiting processes have also been canceled, with the college football regular season, which is due to start in August, being under consideration now. And a lot of focus has been turning to the NFL draft, which is still scheduled to go on between April 23rd and 25th, although in a scaled down version, opposed to the Las Vegas affair that they were planning originally. And we've gone over the potential top 10 picks so far and the depth of the wide receiving class. And this draft class has already been talked about as one of the deepest, especially in modern history. So we're going to continue to take a look at depth by position. And in this episode, we're going to focus more on what teams consider the most effective way to set up a franchise for success. And that usually comes down to getting the most important position in sports, right? Largely considered the most important position. It's especially beneficial when it's on a cap-friendly rookie contract. So selecting and grooming your franchise signal caller is usually a hit-or-miss endeavor, especially when it comes to picking one from the draft. But it's a high-risk, high-reward situation. And getting that pick right often leads to quarterbacks being pushed up draft boards and teams being more willing to take a risk and see where it takes them than take a safer route. And since the NFL is largely a what have you done for me lately type league, there's a lot less patience for these rookie quarterbacks to be able to get on the field and produce. And usually the most high-profile first-year passers get thrown into the fire right away. But rest assured, teams will take immediate readiness into account this offseason, especially since there are a lot of teams that are looking to fill that hole, whether for their QB1 or QB2 positions, when they're looking at what appears to be a top-heavy quarterback draft class. And the 2020 prospects are one of the most talented crops of QBs since 2014, really. And there are several truly elite quarterback prospects that we see at the top of this one this year. And a few names that go far down the list as well, which make them a great developmental spread of talent throughout this class in total. So here's where we start digging into the quarterbacks of the 2020 class. And what better way to start than with Utah State's Jordan Love, who might be one of the most interesting prospects in the drafts. And he's really polarizing because you either really love him after his strong 2018 campaign And there were a lot of high expectations for him going into his 2019 season. But on the other side of the spectrum are people who really hate him because he regressed in his final year before going pro. He threw nearly as many interceptions as touchdowns in his final year before declaring for the draft. He had a ratio of 20 touchdowns to 17 interceptions, which is not good, to say the least. That's not a ratio that is impressive for a quarterback at all. And the argument about him ranges as to whether it's the regression is fully on him or if it's the product of his surroundings and due to the fact that he was under more pressure in 2019 and more of his passes had to go into tight windows, and that had a lot to do with the coaching change and the supporting cast change around him. Only 2 offensive starters returned for his 2019 season, including Love himself. So there were a lot of adjustments that he had to make just in general that he had no control over. And a lot of people cut him slack on his 2019 season and focus on his 2018 season because of those things. But at the same time, there are a lot of changes that come in the NFL as well. Maybe not an entire overhaul of supporting cast changes in one season, but the NFL does have a high turnover rate in terms of career length and also just how long individual players stay with certain teams. So he might have to adjust a lot more than he did in his couple years at Utah State once he hits the pros. And if he was already showing signs of regression in a one-season difference between 2018 and 2019, with a change, how well can he handle the kind of obstacles the NFL is going to throw at him? And that's a question that really should be asked more when Love is considered. And in my opinion, it kind of just shows that he's a little bit overrated in terms of his draft positioning so far. Because he's the epitome of a high-risk, high-reward prospect. He can show off his cannon of a right arm and his movement skills, which translated into a good workout at the combine. And he ran a 40-yard dash time of 4.65, which isn't horrible for a quarterback by any means, but it's not particularly impressive or standing out as one of the best or anything like that. And team sources reportedly also voted him as one of the most overrated prospects for this year's draft class. So he might end up sliding a little bit lower once the actual draft arrives than is predicted for him right now. And there's a lot of hype surrounding him again because of his combine performance, but as we know, that doesn't always translate to what teams are searching for and what they're actually going to go with when they're making their picks at the draft, or how successful a player can be once he hits the NFL. So he had some buzz about being a prospect coming off of his 2018 season, as mentioned before, where he had a 64% completion percentage and passed for over 3,500 yards with 32 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. So he showed that he has some good tools to work with if he was to go pro and be selected as a quarterback in this year's draft. His strong arm can fire some lasers down the field and to the sideline. He has a good eye to be able to place the ball where it needs to be at times because he had to throw into such tight windows in his last season at Utah State. And he shows the ability to put a lot of air under the ball and loft passes between defenders to reach his open receivers, which can usually be tough for strong arm quarterbacks like Love, because they sometimes can become too reliant on the fastballs and more about the power than the accuracy or the touch that an individual play needs. So luckily for Love, he doesn't have that issue, and that's one of the pluses that you get with him. That's one aspect of his game that doesn't have to be developed on or worked on, and that's really helpful when it comes to the pro level because that allows a team's focus to go elsewhere on more adaptable or more important skills that need to be developed. But he does still have a lot to work on when it comes to his field vision, and it is not as good as it should be for a quarterback that is projected to be a first or second round caliber draft pick. He is consistent when it comes to locking his eyes on his primary target, and he doesn't move that away, and that is so dangerous when it comes to opposing defenses because they'll be able to read the play in no time, and on an NFL level, that's going to result in a lot more interceptions than you saw of him in college, and needless to say, that's not good. So that's definitely one thing that he would have to work on if he was going to hit the field as a starting quarterback within the next 3 or so seasons. And if that's a goal for him, no matter where he goes, he has to start being able to read the field and work through his progressions and make better decisions on the fly than he's shown in the past. More of like a Patrick Mahomes type quarterback who is able to trick defenses and not give away where he is directing the play to go. And that's obviously a very rare skill. It's one that you see a lot of quarterbacks developing now. It's not one that was always prioritized, but it just goes to show how much more competitive the NFL is and how much more talent there is. So being a quarterback who is in the pocket and not able to appropriately throw defenses off of your play is definitely going to hinder him at the next level. And according to team sources again, they felt that he should have returned for his senior season to improve a little bit more before going to the NFL, which would have been a good idea in my opinion as well, because a little more progression and really just practice in the game for a professional level really does make a difference, barring injury, of course. And that's a lot of the reason why players don't always choose to go back for their senior years, which is totally understandable because injuries are unpredictable. And if you have a chance to start making your money as soon as possible, a lot of players are in that position where that needs to be their choice. And that's really respectable. But he was one who decided to declare for this year's draft instead of waiting till next year. But that also could have presented another opportunity for him to regress even more in case it was a individual regression problem and not just the fact that he had a lot of change in his supporting cast around him. So we'll never know whether or not he would have hindered or helped himself by returning for another year. But when it comes to where he might get picked up now based off of what he's presented of himself so far, he's kind of projected to go around the mid rounds. On mock draft boards, he's seen as early as the late first round, which I think would be way overreach for him, especially in this draft class that has a few developmental prospects and some that have more winnability experience than Jordan Love does, or even just more experience in general. But that being said, with his booming arm and his mobility again, he does have a starting skill set under his belt. It's just that he's more of a project that one team will have to fall in love with, rather than expect him to be a guaranteed steady starter as a rookie quarterback. So there's a good chance that Jordan Love could begin to slide in this year's draft. And if that were to happen, it would be really interesting if a team like, say, the Green Bay Packers, who are picking at the end of the first round for their first pick, and don't necessarily have any needs outside of wide receiver for Aaron Rodgers, who's still playing at an elite level, so they're not looking for an immediate replacement. But that being said, hear me out, he is 36 years old, and there has been a little bit of a slippage in his performance compared to the peak of his career that we've seen from him in Green Bay. And since they've had such stability at the quarterback position for so long, starting with Brett Favre before they groomed Aaron Rodgers behind him, if they wanted to get ahead of picking their successor, their next franchise quarterback, a talented player who has a little bit of a developmental side, like Jordan Love, could be the answer to finding another 15 plus years of stability at the quarterback position for Green Bay. And they could take their time developing Jordan Love into Aaron Rodgers' potential eventual replacement. And what better way to develop your skills at the professional level than to learn from one of the best in Aaron Rodgers? And it's just a proposal. It's just a hypothetical of one way a team could draft come April. But it would also be a position in the league that would make sense for Jordan Love. And speaking of positions that make sense for Jordan Love, after this break, we're going to come back and talk about some of the other teams that are in need of a starting quarterback.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And before the break, we took a look at one of the first prospects of this developmental side of the quarterback class in Jordan Love. And in this next segment, we're going to take a look at some of the teams that are going to be looking to choose some of these quarterbacks in the April 23rd through 25th draft. So the first team we're going to take a look at is the Miami Dolphins. And it's very obvious that the Miami Dolphins were a team that have been on the search for their next quarterback for a couple of seasons now. They've had a couple of patchwork quarterbacks come into play, such as Ryan Fitzpatrick, who turned into Ryan Fitzmagic a couple of seasons ago out of nowhere. They've had Josh Rosen, who really didn't end up being the answer there either. So they're back to Ryan Fitzpatrick as a bridge quarterback, who also ended up being their team leader in rushing yards, which just goes to show another hole that they really have to fill. But with all the temporary fixes, they are in a desperate need to find their true quarterback of the future. And they're in a really advantageous spot because they have an estimated $88 million in cap space, one of the highest teams with that amount of cap space, and they have 3 first-round picks alone and 14 total. So no team in the league has more room to grow this offseason than the Miami Dolphins, who can cross off a lot of needs off their lists within the first 2 rounds alone, where they have 5 picks between the two. So they have enough draft capital to get pretty much anyone they want and anywhere they want in round 1. But the trouble is that they might have to jump a few spots, either forward or backwards, depending on what they're thinking, to grab their desired QB target. But it wouldn't be a shock if they used their stash of capital to grab Tua, maybe jumping up to number 3 and trading with the Detroit Lions to get their quarterback, if that's who they have their eyes on, like we all expect. But you never know. Sports aren't predictable, which is why we love them so much. So it's also an option for them to address another need with their first pick and maybe fall back and pick another quarterback that they have their eyes on, because there are a lot in this class and they have a lot to work with. So we won't know anything for a few more weeks for sure. But if they're not planning on having a player that take the reins right away, like immediately, there might be some room for Fitzmagic to work with the team for a little while longer before they introduce their rookie, in which case they can really expand their options. And maybe if they pick their players right, Miami could be a force to be reckoned with sooner rather than later. But those are high expectations from the Miami Dolphins, and we'll have to wait and see what happens with them. And that brings us to the Los Angeles Chargers, because after 14 seasons of nothing but Phillip Rivers, this has been the offseason of the quarterback for them. And so far they haven't actually added a quarterback. They've been kind of quiet on that front. And they certainly almost will change that with the draft. And since they kind of fell back in the Tom Brady sweepstakes, it's kind of becoming a little more obvious that their plan might be to find their next signal caller within this rookie class. And a lot of mock drafts and forecasts have kind of had them selecting Justin Herbert at number 6 as of now. And really, there are still a couple more free agent quarterbacks on the market, like Cam Newton, but it's looking unlikely as of right now that they're going to sign him. So unless that changes, the talk surrounding them and which quarterback they're going to pick will only intensify as April 23rd gets closer and the first round approaches. So their mission for the remainder of this offseason should be for sure to make sure that Tyrod Taylor is a bridge to a more exciting quarterback, because Tyrod Taylor he's a solid quarterback so far, but he's been more of a placeholder in his career after losing his job to Baker Mayfield in 2018, and he's only been a consistent starter for 3 seasons since then, barely managing 3,000 passing yards in 2 of those seasons. So the Chargers need a much stronger arm and better accuracy out of their quarterback in order to maximize the talents of their receivers like Keenan Allen and speedster Mike Williams and tight end Hunter Henry. So on the positive side for Tyrod, and maybe on the negative side for some Chargers fans who might want to look outside the current roster for their quarterback, if there's any coach that'd be willing to take a chance on Tyrod being his starter, at least to start out the season, it would be head coach Anthony Lynn, who has made clear that he values a mobile quarterback and the ability to use his quarterback to enhance the rushing game, which is kind of been his area of expertise. But most likely, even with last year's 5th round pick, Easton Sticks, also still on the roster so far, the Chargers will probably use one of their 7 picks to take the quarterback of the future. And he'll probably, whoever it is, have a good chance of immediately becoming their present quarterback. and who that ends up being remains to be seen. And another team that is searching for a quarterback, although it's more hard to believe that we're discussing QBs in terms of team needs for them than anything else, but here we are. And here we're talking about the New England Patriots, who for the first time in almost 2 decades need to find a new starting quarterback. And even just saying those words is a little strange still, but it's true that Tom Brady is set to join the Tampa Bay Bucks. So that leaves for the New England Patriots second-year quarterback Jarrett Stidham at the top of their depth chart. And if we were the Patriots, we would probably be looking to draft a quarterback in this draft for sure. But according to some analysts, reportedly the team is expecting Stidham to be that guy for their foreseeable future. So even if Belichick believes in him, the Patriots probably should still add insurance at the position. So take that announcement of Stidham as the guy with a grain of salt. That probably doesn't mean that they're not going to be looking for quarterbacks at all, because they are definitely a smarter franchise than that, and they definitely need to work on that depth. So the good news for them, at least, is that very few coaches have a better track record of finding mid and late round quarterbacks than Bill Belichick. And you'll probably hear a few stories about Stidham being the diamond in the rough that Belichick found in round 4 of last year's draft. But given all of that, and adding in the fact that veteran Brian Hoyer, who has bounced around the league for a very long time, will also get a legitimate crack at the starting job, we're betting that Belichick would probably prefer a quarterback with a higher floor instead of gambling on a young guy. But either way, it's likely that they're going to be in the market to draft a high caliber quarterback at some point in the near future. And the fact that this year gives so many options, and Belichick is a kind of coach that likes to develop his own talent and kind of mold players to fitting within his system, this could present the perfect opportunity for him. So even though they're putting out a lot of contradicting messages about where they're planning to go, it wouldn't be surprising if they went with a player who wouldn't really wow anybody with his physical talent, but could handle an expansive playbook early on in his career, and comes from a Belichick-approved program and has experience winning and overachieving in his playing career before. And that sounds like a player that we will get to a little later on in the podcast, but right now we're going to take another break. And when we come back, we're going to jump back into taking a look at the next quarterback.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And in the first two segments, we went over one quarterback from this year's draft class that is more on the developmental side, and a few of the teams that might be looking to take a quarterback of that caliber. And in this segment, we're going to jump right back into the next player on the list, and that would be Jacob Eason of Washington, who sat out the entire 2018 season after transferring from Georgia, surprisingly. And he was injured in the 2017 season opener for Georgia. And then Jake Fromm, who went on to become their starter for the rest of the season, took over from there. So once Eason was healthy, they didn't want to change their winning formula because Fromm was leading the Bulldogs pretty well. So they kept him as a backup. And after that season ended, he transferred to Washington. So since that move came, he's had 2 full seasons under his belt as a starter, once at Georgia and once at Washington last year. And he developed a lot of confidence to be able to throw into tight windows. And his ideal size really helps with that. He measures up to 6'6" and 231 pounds, so he is definitely a very sturdy quarterback. And has the ability to rip the ball again into tight windows and have the ball fly off his hands. So he really has a lot of power in his throws. But at the same time, it's also seen as a downside for a lot of teams because not every pass needs to be a fastball, especially when you're translating to the NFL level. So while, again, for him, just like Jordan Love before him, returning to school in 2020, probably would have made sense for his development to continue and, if anything, would have helped his draft stock even more for next season, barring any injuries. There's a chance that a team that's looking for a vertical passing attack or looking for maybe a QB2 with a complementary skill set can take a chance on Eason in the first round or early in the second round. And a lot of that would probably be attributed to his performance at the Combine, where he threw the ball pretty well and showed off that big arm that I mentioned not too long ago. His 40-dash time of 4.90 was on the lower side. It wasn't super impressive, but for a quarterback, that's not always what teams are worried about, even though he could stand to improve a little bit on his feet. He's more of a pocket passer, but he did complete about 64% of his passes last season for just over 3,100 yards and added in 23 TDs and 8 interceptions as well. So he definitely showed off his powerful arm and his ability to stretch the field and defenses vertically very well. He can make all the fastball throws into tight windows that you want. And that's going to be really impressive for him on the NFL level. And that's probably where he's going to shine the best. That's what will allow him to beat good coverages. And if he's able to be paired with a speedster wide receiver, it could really end up blowing up on the NFL level, depending on what team he lands with. So between that and his field vision and ability to work through progressions and stand tall in the pocket and be able to see the field well enough to complete the play, he's a lot more accurate than you would expect for somebody with his experience to be, especially in the short to intermediate parts of the field where he's able to make some of his most effective throws downfield and completions in big plays. So luckily for him at Georgia, he built a lot of that initial experience working in an offense that was underneath a respected offensive coordinator in Jim Chaney, and that translates really well into the NFL, more so than a lot of college offenses these days do that are being used even though there is a little bit of a shift in where the NFL is going and is kind of morphing more into the college game, it's not necessarily completely translatable yet. But with that being said, his limited experience, only being 2 years as a full starter, leaves him a bit raw in his skill set. So he needs to show a little bit more growth in his football instincts, and that will probably come from just being on the field more and getting reps in practices with an actual NFL team, or getting put into a game over time. So as a passer, he definitely still has some stuff that he needs to work on, including putting a little more air under the ball in some passes, but also knowing when to throw a little bit more softly, and make the balls a little bit more catchable for his receivers sometimes. But that's an issue that you see a lot with big arm quarterbacks. So it's not something that's just specific to him, but it is an area that he needs to work on. As well as climbing the pocket and drifting backwards. It kind of is a bad habit that he has, and it kind of leads to the breakdown of the play a little bit, even though he's not a running threat. And doesn't really use his feet a lot. He can still make a little bit of some movement to kind of scramble a bit, and his size in general just makes him hard to take down. But overall, he's just generally inconsistent, and all around he needs development. So he's another player that probably should have returned for his senior year, but now that he's in the 2020 draft, he's being put to the test in a lot of different ways by NFL squads. And the eye test, for one, is one that he passes easily, because he's the type of built quarterback that teams love at 6'6" and 227 with a booming arm. So that archetype of quarterback already checks off a lot of boxes. Even if a lot of people nowadays don't think that it matters much in the modern game, it's still something that a lot of scouts look for. But like a lot of other developmental talents on this list, he is going to need an ideal situation if he's going to thrive at the next level. And he definitely shows positive signs of growth, which is a good sign, is one thing that NFL teams always want to see. But he's also shown a lot of up and down to his play. So his peaks are really intriguing, but his valleys are just a huge mix of bad plays littered in. And he's more of a thrower, since he wants everything to be a fastball, instead of switching up based off of the play in front of him and what it calls for, to compensate for who he's throwing to. So all in all, there's enough there for an NFL team to want to salvage his skills and want to develop him. And just from purely an arm strength perspective, he could be considered at the top of the 2020 quarterback class. So there's a reason why he's being spoken of pretty highly, even though it is, just like Jordan Love, probably a little too high, given how much he still has to develop and how far he still has to go. But there are still a lot of great things that you could say about him, like the fact that he's not afraid to take shots downfield. He's used to a vertical pass-oriented offense and has enough traits to continue to develop for years down the road. So if he started out in an ideal system with good wide receivers who are able to do a lot of the work, and also behind maybe a more experienced veteran quarterback where he can learn for a couple of years, since he didn't return to school, he could definitely find a way to make his way in the NFL. But he could have some growing pains if he was asked to start right away. which brings us to a team that would kind of fit that category for the kind of quarterback Jacob Eason is, and that would be the Bucks, who, yes, just won Tom Brady in the free agency sweepstakes, but for that reason alone, they could be looking ahead to giving him a little help now that they have a major hole in their offense filled, and they do still need some work on the defensive side of the ball in the first round probably, but if they were going to take a quarterback in the later rounds to eventually learn from and then take over for Brady, who is only signed for the next 2 years, it could be beneficial for Easton to end up in Tampa Bay. And he would be a fit for Bruce Arians' offense down there, and he would have the time that he needs to develop, and it would be behind Tom Brady. And what better chance do you have than if you're learning from the greatest quarterback of all time? So, in a perfect world for Eason, that could be his end result. But like everything else, we're going to have to wait till the draft in order to find that out for sure. And that brings us to our next break. But when we come back, we're going to jump into the last 3 teams that are on the hunt for a quarterback.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And before the break, we talked about the second quarterback developmental prospect in this episode. And earlier we talked about 3 teams that are in need of probably a developmental quarterback. So in this segment, we're going to go forward and finish off the rest of the teams that could be looking to complete their quarterback depth charts. So the first team for this segment is the Chicago Bears. And that isn't necessarily because they expressly have a need for a quarterback, but it has more to do with the fact that it's basically make or break time for Mitch Trubisky, who's their former number 2 overall pick. And there might be a new threat to him in town since they acquired quarterback Nick Foles from the Jacksonville Jaguars in this offseason. So, 2017 Super Bowl MVP could just be what Trubisky needs to fire himself up and fight for a starting spot. Or, maybe it's finally time for the Bears to oust Trubisky as their starter and move on from the quarterback. And he's done enough to help the Bears make the playoffs 2 seasons ago, but they didn't really make any progress from there last year, and at times he was the reason why they lost or didn't perform well. So he isn't really a bust just yet, but he's been trending downwards in the last few years, so he's approaching that title possibly. So that means the pressure is officially on, and the Bears organization needs to either see him take a step forward noticeably or write him off as a disappointment, so that they can move on as a franchise and find another solution. So since uncertainty is reigning in the Windy City right now, it seems like they have to up the ante a little bit and bring it in a little more competition of some sort. So someone who will push not just Trubisky, but Nick Foles as well, who didn't have a super stellar season in Jacksonville before going down to an injury and breaking his collarbone. But they could really benefit from adding a rookie to the quarterback competition between Foles and Trubisky. And not only do they have that first round pick, but they don't select again until after pick number 140, after they make their 2 second-round choices. So if they stay put where they are in the second round, they could have their choice of some interesting but risky options at quarterback. But that might just be what they need in order to finally find their quarterback of the future, but not have to pay up as much as they did to get Trubisky. And the next team on the quarterback search, which might come as a little bit of a surprise, seeing as they just signed a quarterback to a 1-year deal this offseason, is the Indianapolis Colts, especially after Andrew Luck's sudden retirement a couple years ago. And that kind of sent them into a little bit of a spiral, not as bad as it could have been, but that hot start they got from their backup, Jacoby Brissett, exceeded expectations, but only for a little bit. And he suffered a week 9 knee injury, but that might not have been solely to blame for his downslide. So he also might have just hit his ceiling as a starting quarterback. We'll never know what it could have been if he hadn't gotten injured. But now they have quarterback Phillip Rivers, but he's only playing on a 1-year deal, and he is 38 years old. And on top of that, neither he nor Brissett are signed after this season. So it's not an obvious need, but it's a sneaky need that they should be looking out for at the position of quarterback. And so far in the offseason, they've already come out with a bang, and they traded their first-round pick to the 49ers in exchange for defensive lineman DeForest Buckner. So they filled a major position need on the defensive line, and they filled a short-term need at quarterback with Phillip Rivers. So even though giving up that 13th overall pick is a tough position to be in, it seems to have been a worthy investment for them so far. But not holding on to it will still limit their ability to add impact talent in this year's draft. So since for the second year in a row they are out of the first round, after also trading out last year, they still are stocked with plenty of capital to work with and are still kind of in a great position to land somebody who can impact right away, or at least in the next couple of years early on in this draft. So they have enough capital at the beginning and in the middle to late rounds to find some gems if they're careful. And they have a great teacher in the quarterback position, and Frank Reich, that can help elevate any rookie quarterback's play. So they still have picks 33 and 34 in the second round. They could definitely focus on picking a developmental prospect with either one of those picks. So given their need, that would probably be a smart route to go down. So whether it's going to be a developmental name in the draft is not really the main question in those middle rounds, but really it'll come down to which developmental name it'll end up being. And that brings us to the final team that is in search of a quarterback, which is the Las Vegas Raiders, no longer the Oakland Raiders. And their GM, Mike Mayock, has relatively been firm in supporting current quarterback Derek Carr, especially during the Combine. And he pointed out a lot of deficiencies that they had elsewhere when he was attempting to explain why the Raiders struggled so much offensively last season. And that's not a huge question mark. There are a lot of reasons why the Raiders struggle. They don't score a lot in the red zone. They don't score in goal-to-go situations. They don't force enough turnovers. There are a lot of other reasons that weren't Carr's fault. But at least some of the scoring woes do fall on his shoulders, because in the quote-unquote most important position in football, the quarterback does get some of the blame at some point. So it's up to John Gruden whether or not he wants to push for a new option under center, or whether or not he'll just run it back with Carr and just see whether or not an improved receiving core around him after this offseason will be enough. But they wouldn't necessarily hurt if they went the same route as maybe the Chicago Bears and threw in a young rookie quarterback who could push Carr to fight for his starting job all over again and kind of make it a little bit interesting in possibly taking the job. But in addition to throwing a rookie into the mix, they also made it a little more interesting by acquiring Marcus Mariota to a deal in free agency. So they made it clear that he'll be coming in as the number 2 option to Derek Carr. And it's a chance to revitalize his career if Carr does take a step back. But it would still be expected for Vegas to bring in a quarterback in this draft. So having 2 picks in round 1 helps. And especially that later pick at number 19 could be where they take a developmental pick. And there is one specific one that would make a very good fit with everything that the Raiders stand for. And after the break, we're going to discuss more about it.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, in the first 4 segments, we talked about 2 of the first developmental quarterbacks and 6 teams that are on the lookout for them. And in this 5th segment, we're coming down to the last, but certainly not the least, out of developmental quarterbacks. And that would be Jalen Hurts out of Oklahoma. And he initially started his career at Alabama, as a lot of college fans know, and had a lot of success there by helping the program to some huge wins during his career. But he did struggle a bit, especially in the pocket, and that kind of led him to his being reassigned as a backup in 2018. But as a backup, he completed 73% of his passes still for just over 760 yards with 8 touchdowns and only 2 interceptions. So the year before, when he was a full-on starter, he regressed a tiny bit from the season before as a freshman, with his completion percentage going down by 2% from 63 to 61 within the year, and his touchdown count going down from 23 to 17, as well as his yards from over 2,700 passing yards to just over 2,000. But he did manage also to reduce his interceptions greatly. So he has had more of an up and down career season, especially earlier in his career. But he has shown that he has the ability to bounce back and put on a better performance and improve, especially after his good workout at the NFL Combine, where he showed off his arm quality, his speed, and his athleticism, putting up one of the best 40-yard dash times for quarterbacks with a 4.59 dash. So after transferring, he was able to improve on his public perception, really, and his credibility to be a consistent starter by bringing his pass completion percentage back up from earlier seasons where he was the full starter to 70% and topping 3,800 passing yards with 32 touchdowns and 8 picks. So he was receiving a lot of hype, especially from ESPN and other sports media outlets, of course, all season, especially because he transferred from one big name program to another. That puts him right in the spotlight, and a lot of attention was on him for those years. But from some sources, even though there was a lot of praise surrounding them, he was still getting criticized for his struggles in reading defenses or his accuracy or his lack of a dynamic running ability that could translate to the NFL. So a lot of people felt that Hurts is tough and he's a winner. And he's been surrounded by a winning culture, so they can see a team taking him in like the mid rounds if they really like him and want to be able to work with him, potentially as a backup to start, who might be able to contribute in different roles, kind of like how Taysom Hill has become a Swiss Army knife of a player in New Orleans for the Saints. So, of course, you always have the naysayers who suggest that he should move to another position. Some people think that he should play fullback, given his size. But he has refused to work out at any other position but quarterback and maintains that he, first and foremost, is a quarterback, just like we've seen other young quarterbacks recently have to battle to stay at their position, like Lamar Jackson or like a Deshaun Watson a few years back. So he's shown that he has phenomenal character on and off the field, and he really comes off as such a professional. But he did give off a little bit of those struggles that people talked about on the field during the Senior Bowl. So his intangibles are more of what are getting him his attention and are going to get him drafted by whatever team ends up picking him, because he's known as a respectable guy and the kind of guy that coaches want in their locker room. One of the guys that can be a leader and be a role model, especially to the players that are going to come after him. So he, in intangibles, he might be the top quarterback in this year's draft, but he isn't necessarily a franchise quarterback, at least not to start, not as an instant starter. He does have the potential to be, because he's a great athlete and he has great playmaking ability, but he has to improve his play under pressure a little bit more if he's going to be successful at the NFL level. And his ability to understand and read defenses is also going to have to be worked on if he wants to come off as a reliable NFL starter. So that culture of success behind him, especially, and his winning attitude and his respectable attitude definitely plays to his advantage. And that comes from, only losing 2 games as a true freshman and sophomore at Alabama before he was unseated by Tua as the starting quarterback. But all of that plays into his journey, because that led him to, of course, Oklahoma and playing under head coach Lincoln Riley. And that's where his pass motion, his comfortability, and his efficiency overall just took a massive leap in his last season. And he ended up being the Heisman runner-up to Joe Burrow, one of the Heisman runner-ups. So obviously this was a season that was quite unique. But in any other, he probably would have stood out a lot more and gotten a lot more attention. And it's probably not the first season of his career where that's the truth. You know, if it wasn't for Tua being such a legend talent as he's shown to be in at the college level, Jalen Hurts probably wouldn't have been replaced as a quarterback, at starting quarterback by anybody else but Tua. So he's just kind of fallen behind other greats that have come at the same time as him. And that might leave him a little underrated. But luckily for him, he's only 21 years old. He's still really young. And from all reports and accounts about him, he's very coachable. So he'll continue to improve on his processing in the moment and his ability to stay in the pocket. And even if those traits did remain weaknesses, he's still a really valuable runner, and he has the ability to continue to play on his feet. He even led college football, including running backs, in red zone rushing touchdowns last season with 17. And he could have a short yardage role as even a backup quarterback for any number of teams, and that still might be selling him short. So he definitely has a starting level upside with some development to go under his belt. But in this case, how many quarterbacks at this point don't? And even though he could still obviously use some improvement as a passer, he embodies a lot of what a lot of teams are looking for, especially the Las Vegas Raiders, which we talked about in the last segment, might be looking for a quarterback that they can draft and kind of either fire up their current starter, Derek Carr, to play to his potential, or potentially find their replacement for Derek Carr. And the team that their GM, Mike Mayock, has been trying to build since he took over has kind of been around arm strength in a quarterback who can make throws to the receivers anywhere on the field, has the ability to extend plays with his legs and create big plays through the air or on the ground, but also is smart enough to control his competitive spirit and use it in an advantageous way. And Hurts surprisingly fits all of those criteria points, and he could likely go around the second round or late first round. And even though the Raiders don't currently own a second round pick, they do still have 2 first round picks and a lot of later draft capital that they can work with to potentially move up and snatch what could be their developmental quarterback of the future. And that brings us to our last break. But when we come back, there are some honorable mention developmental QBs that haven't gotten a chance to really be in their own spotlight. And we'll talk about them when we come back.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. In the first 5 segments, we talked about 3 developmental QBs and 6 teams that are in the search for a quarterback and could potentially take any one of the names that were mentioned in this episode. But there are a lot more quarterbacks in this draft class that have been talked about and deserve to be talked about than have gotten the spotlight because the quarterback position especially is very top heavy. So in this last segment, we're going to go through the 5 honorable mention quarterbacks from this draft class. And to start that group off, is quarterback Jake Fromm out of Georgia, who completed 60% of his passes last season for over 2,800 yards, 24 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. And that makes him generally an accurate quarterback who makes good decisions in the moment and is efficient at managing games. And that's a very rare skill set for a quarterback who is entering the NFL as a rookie. But his gritty play style seems to come in best in crunch time. So that is where a lot of his scouting attention is coming from, because he was able to, not in the flashiest way, but in the most effective way, get wins at Georgia. But that being said, he doesn't necessarily have a starter skill set that is immediately ready for the NFL, because his arm strength still needs a little work. It's average at best, and he won't be a running threat when it comes to the pros, especially compared to other running quarterbacks that defenses have gotten used to defending. So his intangibles and the fact that he's a winner are what is giving him a lot of his attention right now. And a team could easily fall in love with those traits and draft him higher than what his physical talent or his projected mock draft placement expects him to go so far. But he does have a lot of positives that would attract a team towards taking a flyer on a quarterback like Fromm. He is confident and calm, poised under pressure, efficient, again, in the pocket especially, and can stand really tall and remain a consistent passer while showing good timing and precision when hitting his receivers. But because he's not just using his arm to complete the play, he's also able to help his receivers produce more yards after they catch his pass as well. So for a young quarterback, he's had an impressive resume so far. He has an impressive field vision since he started at Georgia. And while he doesn't have an arm cannon, he definitely will still challenge defenses vertically down, and he isn't afraid to go down the field. So there's still a lot to like about him and anticipate that he'll translate into the NFL well. Especially since his rhythm would translate well into a West Coast offense style. And luckily, some of the most important traits that a quarterback needs to have and that most teams will be looking for is the accuracy that he shows and his ability to place the ball well and in a good position for his receivers. So all in all, he's a great decision maker. He can protect the ball well, and he doesn't panic or get careless. So all of that translates into him being a dangerous play-action passer who can still come through with clutch moments and can have plenty of success in the right situation, although he won't be the player to carry a roster on his own. So teams who are looking for that primary quarterback probably shouldn't and wouldn't go for Fromm, and his best fit is probably somewhere within an established quick-hitting offense where he could get through reads pretty quickly and his targets get to do the bulk of the work after the catch. And there are a few teams that come to mind that he'd be a great fit for. And next on the list is Anthony Gordon out of Washington State. And he was another productive college quarterback. And he played under passing genius Mike Leach after replacing Gardner Minshew as the starter. And he won that starting job in 2019. And he then went on to complete 72% of his passes for over 5,500 yards, 48 touchdowns, and just 16 interceptions. So he definitely put on a clinic out west at Washington State. But, of course, schools out west don't necessarily get a lot of the TV time that schools on the East Coast get. So he went relatively unseen by a lot of the country. And he ultimately ended up improving on the legendary now Gardner Minshew from the season before by throwing over 400 more yards and almost 4 more touchdowns per game than Minshew did the previous year. So his background in baseball probably came into play a little bit and helped him make accurate, out-of-structure throws, but he was specifically praised by Coach Mike Leach for his ability to make pre-snap reads in their infamous air raid offense. So even though he only started one season, he still made the Washington State offense look really impressive, and he still was able to take command of it in a way that even though they had a good quarterback the year before, he wasn't able to do it in the same way. So he showed he has a great understanding of his ability to execute really precise throws in tight windows. And at the other end of that, throw to guys who are wide open and help them also make the play. But at times his physical profile did limit him vertically a little bit, and he was second to last in FBS quarterbacks in percentage of pass attempts that went at least 20 yards downfield, and finished the season with negative 20 rushing yards, which isn't great, obviously. And at the Senior Bowl, he showed that his arm limitations might also translate to the next level at first. But with that being said, Gordon is a daring gunslinger at the passer position, so he's so much fun to watch at the college level that we might have already seen the best from him, since he will be coming into the league as a 24-year-old rookie and is a little bit on the older side as far as athletes go. But he figures to at least be able to compete for a backup job in a quick-hitting offense that can play up to his strengths, and maybe his weaknesses won't have to shine through as much. So he still has the talent to be able to become an NFL starter over time. Third on our list is Shea Patterson out of Michigan, who transferred there out of Ole Miss after starting in 2017 in a tumultuous college campaign for the Rebels, where he completed 64% of his passes for just over 2,200 yards with 17 touchdowns and 9 interceptions before he went down to a knee injury that ended his season. So he's not the most consistent quarterback or the most accurate quarterback, going all the way back to his first year, 2016. And at times he really struggled with his accuracy, especially from the pocket, and his ability to run with the ball. But that helped set up a few good throwing looks. But other than that, he only completed 57% of his passes last season for just over 3,000 yards, with 23 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. So he isn't nearly developed enough as a pocket passer right now to be an early round prospect, because he's really streaky at best. He can make some accurate throws when he's in the rhythm, and he can use his legs to make some things happen, but he really revealed that he has a lot of bad habits that aren't great to see from a quarterback, and that really doesn't invoke a lot of confidence in teams. And in plays that he had a clean pocket, he would still get frantic at times and get rattled by rushes that weren't there, and get flustered and throw away the play. So his field vision and his composure need a ton of work still, and that definitely had an impact on his receivers and his receivers draft stock, like Donovan Peoples-Jones. But he did still possess a quality arm and, the ability to be mobile within his skill set. But even with all of that being said, he still looks like he could be a third-day prospect at best, who should probably be a deep developmental backup for any team that picks him, just to see if he can improve enough to be considered a mainstay QB2. So he still has a long way to go, and that could be seen at the Senior Bowl in Mobile where he really struggled. But there's still enough there that's been seen, especially on a national level in college, for a team to take a flyer on him. And fourth on our list is Khalil Tate out of Arizona, who helped himself over the fall a little bit and earned more draftable mock draft grades from area scouts, even though he didn't participate in the combine. So sources say that he has a good skill set and a strong arm. He's really mobile and athletic and a fast runner. But there are a number of issues with Khalil Tate that push him into being more of a third-day pick. Some say that he has some issues with accuracy. He only completed 60% of his passes last season for just under 2,000 yards and 14 touchdowns, but at the same time, he also threw 11 interceptions. So he also could do a little better job at seeing the field a little longer than he has been, and there are reports that he could struggle with mastering an NFL playbook, as well as some minor character and makeup concerns on his record that doesn't really bode well for a lot of NFL teams' confidence, as we've seen in the past. But some teams do still feel like he has some unique qualities that can get him drafted in one of the middle rounds. And that brings us to our last quarterback prospect out of the honorable mentions, and that's Brian Lewerke out of Michigan State. And some would describe him as one of the guys that seemingly peaked in high school and then rode that success through college all the way to the top, especially after he had an exciting redshirt sophomore season. But then he did regress well behind what he was advertised as, and he was still ultimately able to land a spot in the NFL Combine because he is, at the end of the day, a good athlete who flashes competence in his play in a few times a game. But then the rest of the time, when you watch his tape, it's just littered with confusing plays that leave you wondering what he was thinking. So that's not really the emotion you'd like to evoke from people who are trying to give you a professional job, especially since he had an under 60% completion percentage in 2019 and had a touchdown to interception ratio of 17-13, even though he did top 3,000 yards. But he still looks like a backup caliber quarterback for the NFL, even though he flashed at times during his college career. But he hasn't been consistently productive, and that's certainly going to hurt him at the next level if he isn't able to improve. But that is the essence of what quarterbacks are looking like in this draft class, and teams have kind of adjusted their expectations to that. So there's always a chance that he could end up in a good developmental situation, and you never know which quarterbacks are going to end up lasting a long time and building a long career, and which are going to possibly be one-hit wonders. So thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.